Gender diversity in boards is a critical issue in the United States, and what better way to help us reflect on that than to think about the situation in the UK, and what better way to do that than to talk to Laura Davies, who is the author or the leader of the task force in the UK that finished up a few months ago. I think the lessons in the UK are really instructive for the United States, so we'd like to sort of ask you about your experience, what the recommendations were, and then finish up with the implications for the US.
Great.
Thank you for agreeing to do
Pleasure.
this. Let's just start with the situation before your task force was formed. What were the pressures and issues that were under discussion, and how did the task force itself get formed?
Well, I think I was a minister in the previous government, and actually before that was a bank CEO. So, by the way, if you're a bank CEO and a government minister, you know that's a pretty these days pretty unpopular group of or list of occupations. I think when I was in government, we looked at what do you need to do to be competitive as a nation, and what do you need really to compete internationally, and what makes good business sense. And as a minister for business, I became aware that really the UK was falling behind in the role of women on boards, so that 92% of the top sort of 100 companies, or let's say, take the top 350 listed companies, 92% were male. And at the end of the day, this isn't just about equality, it's about good business sense. So I sort of campaigned for it and spoke a lot about it when I was a minister. And then when the new government, coalition government, came in, they asked me if I would lead this inquiry.
So it came, the pressure or the impetus came from government. Was the business community or investors involved at the beginning? Or?
Yeah, well, I think actually the business community had talked a lot about it, and there have been various attempts over the last 10, 20 years to sort of force a change. So inevitably lots of discussion about it in the media, etc., but nothing really happening. Slight improvement in percentages in maybe in the last decade. But you know, when you've got a boardroom that is 92% male, then you need a radical change. And this is about, as I said, good business sense. You know, what I would argue is the nature of a conversation changes when women are in the room or in a meeting. And I think if you're going to be a great business leader or a great company, you need diversity in the top team. You need people with different intellects, different approaches, but you also need diversity, you know, and gender diversity. So the sort of inquiry team task force was put together as a public inquiry with the business department of government very, very involved. And then we set about talking to all the stakeholders. Now, we consulted with shareholders, with corporate chairmen, with women in business, etc., etc. But one of the most extraordinary things about this inquiry is that we called for evidence. So, you know, on the internet and just openly call for evidence. Normally you'd expect 200 or 300 replies.
You got 2,000.
2,600, and we had to read them.
Right.
And I think the quality of the submissions was extraordinary. Right. So lots of engagement, lots of input.
And let me follow up on that, on the 2 points you made. One is 2,600 inquiries, and the point you made about the business impact of diversity on boards and in management teams. There's a lot of research, a growing body, that shows clearly that diversity leads to different and better decision making and then better financial performance. But I was struck by a statistic, and I don't mean to dive deep into them, but I remember something when those 2,600 respondents were polled on what they thought the important benefits were. Only a minority of them talked about the business benefit. More of them talked about the culture and the changes and so forth. How deeply understood or believed is that business benefit point?
Oh, I think if I think it is understood. I think when we got engagement and started to talk to the shareholders and the chairman and the companies generally, I think everybody said, look, we get it. We realize, you know, if your client base has, say, 50% women, you know, 50% female, if 50% of your staff are female, then how come your board has either no women or a tiny percentage? Your board of directors is not representing your business, your clients, or indeed your staff. how can that be good business sense? So I think there was a realization. Now the question is, so what do you do about it? Great, there's a problem out there, and we've had marginal increases, but how do you create a radical change in the boardroom? And clearly, people said, well, you immediately, go for quotas.
Right.
But I think the more we spoke to people, particularly to the women, the more we realized actually quotas is a last resort. The best change would be a sort of self-regulation, a change that comes from within companies and from the boardrooms of the UK.
I think it was described by Roger Carr as a collaborative model as opposed to a coercive model.
Yeah, look, I think immediately people say, well, there's no supply. Well, that's factually incorrect.
Right.
There is a supply of women in the US, in the UK, everywhere. There's a great supply of women and talented women who are eligible to be in the boardrooms of the UK. Then people said, well, it's the headhunters who are not sourcing them. Then it's the shareholders don't care about it. Then it's these male chairmen that part of a club that they're not doing it. I think that there's a little bit of blame on everybody. And that's why in our engagement and in our recommendations, we've got a headhunter code. We've got the chairman declaring what their targets are, anticipated levels are for 2013 and 2015. And then at the same time, we are getting the Financial Reporting Council to get the shareholders involved, because they're the owners of the companies. So they should want their boards to be diverse.
And I'm going to come back in 1 minute to the recommendations. You've started to outline those, and we want to understand them better. But I have one last question about the context as the task force was created. And I'm thinking ahead to our consideration from a U.S. perspective. This project was initiated by the government. Thinking ahead to our discussion about the U.S., where we may have some suspicions about government-led initiatives, how is that government-led process perceived by the business community, by investors, and by society in general?
Well, the government was sponsoring it, but this was an inquiry led by business people. So the steering committee, yes, we had civil servants, as we describe them in the UK, doing the writing, and they did a fantastic job and were amazing support. But the team that I assembled was a cross-section of men and women from a broad spectrum of society and with heavy business concentration.
Right. So it wasn't a problem.
It wasn't a government that saying we're going to do this. It was I'm an ex-CEO and chairman, and obviously having worked in government, we had a range of people to make it a business-led approach.
So you briefly mentioned some of the major recommendations of the task force. Can you go into those in more detail? Tell us what the task force has primarily recommended.
Well, I think that, look, we looked at lots of different country models. We talked to Australia, where there's been a radical change. Looked at the Norwegian model, where there had been quotas. We also looked at the US. I think, just trying to study where is the best practice. I think, at the end of the day, we did stop short of quotas, but we do want more transparency in the nominations committee process of large companies. It is a bit of smoke-filled rooms, and there isn't a lot in the report and accounts about the matrix of requirements, the sort of skills that are needed to run a company. So over time, in the same way we've seen in the US and in Europe, companies paying much more attention and publicizing more about corporate social responsibility, we want to see the same level of attention and disclosure to the makeup of the board that runs the company. And in that regard, that's why we've gone for a disclosure on what is the board aiming to achieve in 2013 and 2015 in terms of women participation in the board. Right. And we want them ideally to be at the 25% level as a minimum. I think the reality is the number of best practice companies are way above that already. A lot of people said, well, go for 30, 40%. Look, we can argue about the percentages. This interview would last about 5 days if I told you all the submissions. Right. We've thought that 25% was a good starting point. But there's a more fundamental issue, and that is, boards of companies should have diversity in the team that should reflect their clients and their business, and having women on a board just makes business sense.
Right. You mentioned quotas as a last resort. In Australia, my understanding is that the Australians have achieved really remarkable progress in a very short period of time by not implementing quotas, but maybe the way to say it is by making the possibility of quotas quite tangible without saying that we're going to have them. In the UK, it seems like you've been more gentle, and I'm sure when we talk to the US, that's not the case.
No, I don't think we've been gentle on this. I think the media has been extraordinarily helpful on this, in really naming and shaming companies that are all male boards, and naming and shaming companies that have made very little progress on this issue. There's a more fundamental issue in America and in Europe, and that is, it's not just the boards that need more women, it's the executive committees of big companies. So now we didn't really tackle that issue in this review, but clearly if you have more women on executive committees, they're going to be more eligible for other boards. I think that the threat of quotas is there. We have made that clear. We want radical change in the UK. We want to see more women, more equality, and we believe it will result in better performance. If that doesn't happen in the next couple of years, there will be quotas. And what we've also said, unusually, is that the steering committee, which was put together, they all got so involved in this subject and were so, worked well as a team. They're going to stay together.
Yes.
We are meeting in October. We're going to review progress and then publish how we think we're doing.
Right. So the pressure will be maintained, right?
The pressure will be maintained.
Well, I don't mean to imply it was a gentle approach, but from an American perspective, the degree of coerciveness or gentleness is going to be the primary debate in our country.
Yeah.
And so understanding where you feel you are on that spectrum, Norway is at one end, is important.
Norway's at one end. I think the best way of a radical change in society, in business, is not for the government to say you've got to do this. It is for business to realise that this is the right thing to do.
Right.
For chairman to say, hey, my board should reflect my company. Therefore, I've got to change the makeup of my board.
All right, so you talked about the policies of disclosure and the targets. You also, interestingly, in my view, have a recommendation, as you mentioned briefly earlier, about search firms and so forth. Talk a little bit about that and why that's important.
Yeah, look, inevitably when you have a problem, everybody points the finger at everybody else is to blame. I think you need the shareholders, as I said earlier, you need the chairman on side, and then you need the headhunters. So what we decided to do was to get a headhunters code of practice. And that has been all the major headhunting firms coming together and writing a voluntary code on the sourcing for boards, on transparency, etc. It's been a real win, I think, as part of this process, to get the firms together and to get them acting almost as a team. They're in competition with each other, but I think they are day to day looking at candidate lists. They know the gene pool that's out there. Look, I think that it's important also to point out that women may do certain types of jobs that are not necessarily sort of mainstream P&L jobs. And I think the headhunters have to be a bit more creative in where they look to for the talent. And that's what's come out of this headhunting code. So yes, a big win, I think.
Let's use this to jump to another of your recommendations, which has to do with training and development. How confident are you that the business community is going to invest and follow up in this area? Particularly given, as you say, that women often have a different mix of jobs than what might be typical for a board member. How do you see the training and development situation? And are you optimistic, for example, that companies will take that recommendation and invest further in it?
Well, I think, look, business at the end of the day, it's about products and et cetera, but it's about people. And I always use the sort of example of a sports, top professionals in sport, they practice, they get coached, and the same is true of business. If you'd said a decade ago that a CEO was going to have a coach or whatever, everybody would have laughed at you. The reality is that there's a realization that you've got to train, develop talent. And that is just as true of a board. I've served on many, many boards of leading companies. And, the reality is you need to be trained, you need to develop as an individual, true of men and women. And we believe that for male and female potential non-executives, there needs to be more investment in the training and development of those individuals. And that's as true in the US as it is in Europe.
Would this effort for training and development be pursued by individual companies? Is there a need or an opportunity to do it collectively as a business community?
Yeah, look, if I could have waved a magic wand and just said, got 10 sponsors as major companies to put together a training development program, yeah, it would have been great. It would have been a win. But the market is the market. So I think what will happen is a number of companies will collaborate. And the big companies will realize that this makes good business sense, maybe collaborating with others and in training and developing leaders of the future.
Good. So that sort of covers the broad recommendations. Let's turn then to, it's premature to talk about the outcomes, but it's been 5 or 6 months.
Yeah.
What are your early impressions of progress? You have a deadline, so to speak, coming up in September. What's
look, early signs are very encouraging, and the sort of public figures are very, very encouraging. That over a third of new appointments to UK boards since the publication of the reports have been women. Now, great. So early signs of progress.
And that's the number you need to reach
and that's the number we need. I won't relax, and neither will the steering committee, until we've seen 2 or 3 years of progress. So early signs, good. The headhunters are very engaged. The chairman that now seem to be getting the message. The Financial Reporting Council, the governance body has got the message. So yeah, I think so far so good, but we will keep the pressure up.
Right. Well, that's actually, if I remember the numbers right, from an international comparison point of view, that's actually quite an extraordinary performance of 33% in such a short period of time. And Australia was 25 or 27.
It is. I think there's always a danger when you do something like this that you come out with a report. And then the chairman say, "Oh, that's great. Don't worry. The fuss will pass."
Right.
This is not about that. This is about making companies more representative of their business. It's about good business sense, and it's not going to be fixed in 3 to 4 months.
Right.
So our view is we've got to keep the pressure up, and 2 or 3 years from now, if we are getting to the 25, 30, 40% sort of mark, then we'll be happy.
We'll declare victory,
then
or
we'll
at least
declare victory.
Partial success.
Yes.
So you've summarized the situation and the recommendations in the UK. Now let's turn to the implications in the US. You have a lot of experience doing business in the US. What do you think are the major similarities or the major differences between the circumstances in the UK and then in the US?
Well, look, I mean, the US is the largest economy in the world. It's got, it is at the end of the day the great strength of the US economy. It's its ability to adapt, and so many of the world's global companies come out of the US. But we've got to accept that the balance of power in the world's changing. The competition is intensifying from India, from China, from Nigeria, from Indonesia, you name it, Russia, Brazil. So I think in the West, we've got to maybe reflect that in some of our competitors, you see more women at the top of business. Now, it's just something to reflect on. So I think when you look at the percentages, I'm not going to make any comment about the US, boardroom, other than to say when you look at the stark percentages of women in the boardrooms in the US, it's not a great number. Yeah. Exactly the same as the UK. And so I think a lot of companies have to ask themselves, why is that? And that's exactly what we've done in the UK. And I think if you're going to be competitive in the modern day, you have to have an international mindset. You absolutely have to have sort of equality and diversity. And I think from the statistics, it looks as if a lot of boards don't have that.
You've run a very big company in Asia. Have you noticed a difference in Asian companies in the boardroom, in senior management teams, and the way they think about gender diversity versus in the West?
Yeah, look, I'm very careful about what I say. About sort of the difference between sort of Asia and the West. But I think we've got to accept these are fast-moving economies. They are emerging economies, but they're emerging very fast. And you do genuinely see a huge percentage of women in senior positions. Now, the social infrastructure is different. And certainly, childcare and all of those issues in the UK certainly is not, in my view, as advanced as it is in parts of Asia. But I think, more importantly, I think companies have to reflect on, we're in a global marketplace, and the competition is intensifying. It is very international, and in Asia, women seem to have very senior roles more often than in the West.
Let me ask you a time-specific question. We're having this discussion a few days before August 2nd, when the debt crisis is looming, and everyone in the U.S. is focused on that issue. You took this issue on in the midst of a huge financial issue in the UK as you were restructuring your whole, economy in the government sector. In the U.S., all the air is being sucked out of the room by these major macroeconomic policy issues. Did you find that a deterrent in the UK? Do you think we'll find that a deterrent in the US?
No, I mean, it's about women watching this will smile. It's about multitasking.
Right.
I mean, basically, just the fact that there's a debt crisis in Europe and the US has its own issues it's absolutely critical. But what we're talking about here is a subject.
It's an enduring issue.
This is a society problem. We've got to fix it. It is absolutely critical to business success. It's also the right thing to do. And yes, there's a debt crisis around the world. There's always issues going on in the world. The reality for business is this has got to be fixed.
Let me put you on the spot. Are you up for a second commission? If we start a task force in the U.S., would you want to go global?
No, I'm not going global. I've done my job. Very happy with just doing the UK.
All right. Well, listen, thank you very much. We're now going to have a broader discussion at this conference about the issues that you've raised, but understanding what happened in the U.S., in the UK, and given that you and your team have studied this extensively, it really gives us a great foundation to debate those issues and to try to figure out how to address this in the U.S. in the same way that you have addressed it here and other countries have begun to address it.
Look, if the discussions that we've had in the UK are anything to go by, it should be a very lively discussion. Excellent. And I hope it goes well.
Thank you very much.